So good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our webinar this afternoon. My name is Margaret Topping, and my role is Associate Pro Vice Chancellor and Dean of the Graduate School at Queen's University Belfast. So a lot of the work that I do is to work with our master's students and our PhD students to support them on their academic journeys. So delighted to have you here on the webinar today. Because we are quite a small group, I think what we'd like to do is to make this a little bit interactive if we possibly can. So I have enabled the chat here on the webinar itself, and hopefully you can see the chat on your screens as well. And the point that really is there, just anytime that you want to ask a question, just jump in on the chat and I'll try and pick up on any questions as we go along. But then we'll also have a session for Q&A at the end of the session itself. So we anticipate being here for about an hour. If there are lots of questions, happy to go on a little bit longer, but also just bear in mind that if anything comes up today that you would like further clarification on, you can absolutely get in touch with us and I can have a follow-on conversation with you. Equally, what I'd love to happen after today is that you would think, yes, I want to consider my PhD options, and therefore you let us know and we will put you in touch with a colleague of mine in whatever school is most relevant in the university who can help you develop your PhD proposal further. So a very warm welcome, and can I just check that everyone has their chat? If you have your chat up and running, can you just send me a little yes message and I know that you're all there with me? Can we get a little comment to say, yes, we're here? Okay, we'll start. I think that, oh, there we go. We've got someone going, thank you very much, Orla. And Victoria and Scott, right, lovely to meet you. Anne, Alan, great to see you all. Any questions that you have as we go along, just stick them into the chat box like that and we will deal with them all. Joshua, Ian, Nicole, welcome. Delighted to have you here. Okay, so the session we have today, I have seen the subject areas that you're interested in, and I've also seen those areas where you are in terms of your own academic journey, and some of you are currently doing your master's courses and thinking about next steps, others at slightly different stages. So I hope to cover as much of that as I possibly can, but please feel free to jump in with any questions. I'm going to start our focus today very much on the PhD proposal, partly because it's something that becomes almost this sort of mythical idea that the PhD proposal, it's what's going to unlock your future. It's a sort of sacred document. There are all sorts of very important aspects that need to be brought into it, like methodology, literature review, research questions, all of these big ideas that sound very much like a different way of thinking and a different way of communicating. So part of what I would like to do today is to start demystifying some of that to help you see in very practical terms how you can begin to build your research proposal. So let's just start with three very simple questions. Forget about all that you've heard around methodologies, research proposals, so proposals, literature review, methodology, and so on. But ultimately, your research proposal for your PhD comes down to three key questions, and those are what, why, and how. And at any point when you're developing your proposal, and indeed any point when you come to write your PhD introduction, and as you move through all parts of your academic journey, what, why, and how are the key questions. So the what is essentially, what are you going to do? What is this research going to be about? What questions is it going to ask? And we're going to demystify each of these elements in turn through the subsequent slides. But your starting point for your PhD proposal is essentially, what is it that I'm going to do in my research? The why question is simply about who cares, essentially. So what? Why should anyone be interested in reading the research that you're proposing to do? And to answer that question, it's partly about saying, well, other people have not looked at this area, so there's a gap in the existing research. Or it might be, for example, that there has been a major societal shift. Let's think of where we are at the moment in the COVID situation. A lot of new research is absolutely essential. because of that. And it's research not just in the scientific field, but also research in the humanities and social sciences, as people will gradually begin to try to make sense of what this has meant for us and the way that we live. So why is partly about the addition that you're making and the contribution you're making to your academic field, but it's also the possibility of making societal changes. And when we think about why, it's about saying to ourselves, who will care about this research? Who will think differently because of it? And who will potentially think about changing policy, practice, behaviours because of it? And then methodology is your how. It's how are you going to do that? And that's everything from I'm going to use such and such a theory to in month 1, I will be doing this. In month 2, I will be focusing on that. In month 3, I will be engaging with my participants, and so on and so on. So in some ways, set aside all of these, the terms that we often use that are associated with research proposals, and just always think to yourself, what, why, and how. So what I'm going to show you in the next slide are some questions that can sit beneath those 3 what, why, how questions that will help you develop your research proposal. So this is just a template which is quite useful for you potentially to use over the next couple of slides. But I will also then come back to each of these 3 overarching questions of what, why, and how, and explain to you what each of them mean in more detail. But this would be a useful template for you if you're thinking about starting to write a PhD proposal. And they're based on those questions. So for our what question, what do we want there? Essentially, we want a single primary research question. That's the hardest part, I think, in many ways, of developing the research proposal. In some ways, it's the hardest part of the first few years of your research. But having absolute clarity about what your research is trying to ask, what it's trying to do. And I'm going to give you some tips for how you might begin to do that. Beneath that, normally you will have a couple of secondary questions. And those secondary questions are about helping you understand the various steps that you need to take in order to ask your one overarching question. So if I wanted to write a thesis, for example, on, and I'm thinking about some research that I've done recently, what is the role of urban cultural festivals in promoting community cohesion? That's a big overarching research question. In order to help me answer that, I've needed to develop a number of secondary questions, such as what is the prevalence of urban cultural festivals? Where have they been developed in areas where there are issues of community cohesion, and so on. So all of those secondary questions are all pieces of the jigsaw that help you ask the one big primary research question. So that takes time to develop. For your why, I think the why is also, should be something that starts with yourself. I mean, research it requires passion, it requires intellectual curiosity, it requires you to believe that what your work is doing can make a difference. So I think it's important to understand why you personally want to work in this area, because often that's the motivation that helps you through what can be often quite a long and challenging journey. But in terms of your research proposal specifically, what you want to answer really here are 2 things. Number 1, why is this important for academic study? And in that case, it really is about saying, what have other people already said in this area? What research has already been collected or created, developed? What is missing in that? What are the key gaps within it? How will my research fill a gap that needs to be filled? And it's not enough simply to say, this hasn't been done before, because my question would be, well, maybe there's a good reason why it hasn't been done. Maybe it's not the right question. Maybe it's not going to add to how we think. So identifying your gap is not just about saying this hasn't been done. It's saying this hasn't been done, but this is why it's really important to do it. And it's because scholars in my field, in other fields, outside the higher education environment are going to think differently because of it. There's a problem that's created. My research is going to help to resolve it. So you have your impacts. Your why is partly about thinking about your response to your academic context, but it's also about asking yourself, what difference will this make? And this is the really hard so what question. This is the one which is where you have to explain to an elderly relative who has no idea why you do what you do, what's the point of what you're doing? And I've had this, it's the hardest thing you can do. It's about telling people this is how things could be different by virtue of what I do. Again, very, very tough. And the how, this is where we are, this is essentially methodology. And the how is your research strategy, for example, is it qualitative or quantitative methods? What specific methods will you use to implement that strategy? You outline your research process, and that is at the level of detail of saying, in months 1 to 3, I will do this. In months 3 to 6, I will be collecting data in this area. In months 6 to 9, I will be analysing the data. And it's also about having that beginnings of a sense of what your thesis might look like. The reality is that the structure and the proposed chapter outlines that you include in your research proposal will change. They will most definitely change, because research is a journey, and you have false turns and you have dead ends, and things that you believe you wanted to explore end up not to be worth exploring. So the structure will change as you go along, but partly your research proposal is about selling yourself to a potential supervisor. It's about saying, I understand this field that I'm working in. I think there's a gap here. I think I can contribute. And I'm demonstrating to you that I have the skills that will help me, that will enable me to make that contribution. So you need to take me on as your supervisee. No one imagines that the research proposal at the beginning will absolutely 100% reflect the thesis that emerges at the end. But it's almost about your sales pitch. And I think it's useful to think of your research proposal as a sales pitch, both to a supervisor, but also to funders. And I'm sure many of you will be interested in the sorts of funding that's available for a PhD study. And when you are applying for that, you've really got to make the case for why your research is important. In some ways, answering the why question is the hardest one, but also the most important one. So if a funder has £10 million that they want to send to distribute for PhDs, you're going to stand out if that person, that funder, that committee thinks to themselves, yeah, this person is going to make a difference. This work is going to change how we think in a scholarly environment, in a policy environment, in a health environment, commercial environment, whatever it might be. I've just included this one, and sometimes this what I've shown you in the last few slides is a template that I would typically use with students who I was hoping to work with for their PhDs. And sometimes it's useful just also to show that you're open to looking in other areas. Sometimes we have supervisors in Queen's who are interested in you as a supervisee, who see that you have real talent, but maybe don't feel that the specific area that you're proposing is one that they really feel that they can supervise. They may not feel that they have all the knowledge that they would wish to have there. I think it's always good to show in those cases that you're open to adjusting, that you're open to working with them to find a project that is going to be exciting for both of you. So I'm going to say a little bit more about each of those areas. I'm going to start with research questions, or our basic question of what. And I might ask you to get a little bit involved and put some thoughts in the chat box as we go along. I think there is maybe a little bit of a delay in the chat, so it may take a little bit of time for some of your comments to come through, but we can take a breather and wait for those to happen. So let's think a little bit more about research questions, or the what. You've got a lot of text here, and I'm going to go through it. But I think what we'll do, which might be most useful, is for you to see some examples of research questions that are really well formulated and others which are not so well formulated. And I think you'll see the difference very, very clearly. So just to run through some of the key ideas here. Your research question is absolutely critical. Your reader should be able to read that one question and know exactly what it is that you are trying to change address, explore, investigate, find a solution to through your research. It defines the proposal. It guides your arguments. It's about getting the person interested. And so it really is the key, and it's worth spending time drafting, redrafting, revising, polishing to get that just right. So as it says here in the second bullet point, really important to give yourself time to do this, because actually a lot of the rest of the proposal will follow in behind once you have your research question in place. Always very good to identify questions that clearly demonstrate their relevance to not just to the academic world, but to society, to a social group. Really important to have research questions that are doable. And this is a hard one, and this is where it's often useful to be working in advance with a supervisor to help them help you define your research. Because I think the starting point is usually that the research being proposed is huge. It's a lifetime's work. It's 10 PhD theses, not one. But that's where we'll work with mentors, with supervisors to help you do that. And yes, remember that writing a research question is an iterative process. In other words, you're doing it again and again and again. Just as when it comes to writing your thesis, you'll draft every section again and again and again. So a few key pointers on what a research question is, what it should look like, and then I'll show you some examples. So it needs to be clear. Really, you need to have all of the data in there. So it might be that some of that clarity is about saying, if I go back to my example before about, for example, urban cultural festivals, that's also a big topic. So I might say, well, what is the impact of urban cultural festivals in promoting community cohesion? Let's make it a bit more specific and clear in post-conflict societies, for example. Just that little bit of extra information gives us clarity, and it also gives your reader immediately a clear understanding of what the scope of your work is going to be. It should be focused enough, and again, to go back to that example I've just given you, if a PhD supervisor were to look at a question which seems to be looking at all urban cultural festivals everywhere, they would think, well, that's not doable. You cannot do that. It's got to be more focused. It's got to be concise. It's got to be complex, by which we mean you can't just answer yes or no. And I'll show you some examples on the next slide of what that looks like. It needs to be arguable. It's not simply a question of collating facts and figures and presenting those. It is about something that you have to engage with critically. You have to come up with a hypothesis for and argue that. And I think the point there, the second from last point, is such an important one. A PhD can be a lonely process, and I see from a lot of the background areas of interest from the people attending today that a lot of you are in arts and humanities and social sciences, that it does tend to be a bit of a lonely place. So it's really important that this is something you care about, because you'll need resilience and determination to keep going at the times when research becomes difficult. The last one, the powerful questions, are very useful. Asking what is the impact? What is the connection between how can we improve X, Y, and Z? Are we all okay? Any questions so far? Okay, let me just move on. And if there is anything that you want to, anything that you want to ask about, just let me know. And this is where, if you're feeling energetic, it would be great to have a little bit of input from you on some of these questions, because what we have here are suggested questions, research questions. And you'll see it'll be very clear to you which column is the good example and which column is the less good example. I think that's what, so we'll have a look at those. I think the other thing perhaps worth mentioning here is that what you'll see about these questions is that they're really quite simply communicated. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges in a research question, and indeed in research generally. We have a tendency to think that we have to adorn our work with very complicated language, key theories, complex ideas. That really doesn't help you in defining your research focus. What you can do with most value is to come up with a fairly simple question, like the ones we have here. And that is what you're trying to prove, or to develop by way of a primary research question. It doesn't have to have lots of theoretical ideas in it. It's simply a question that your thesis is going to respond to. So if we have a look at these examples, we have two columns here. The first one, does owning a pet improve quality of life for older people? Versus in what ways does owning a pet improve quality of life for older people? Would anyone like to jump in and give some thoughts on which of those is better and why, just on the chat box very, very quickly? I'll give you a moment to type. Or as we're doing that, have a look down through the rest of the list. And if there are any particular examples that strike you, please jump in on the chat and give us your evaluation of why one of these is less good. As you'll see, it's the questions in the left-hand column which are less strong, and the ones on the right-hand side are better. Just give me some ideas on how you see the right-hand column as being an improvement on the left. I'll just take a minute and come back to me when you have some thoughts. And I know we also have a little delay, so I will wait a couple of minutes here. Okay, we may have, it may be that some of you are typing. Oh, hold on, I think we've got something. I think this is Nicole. Thank you for jumping in. Nicole says, I think the right-hand column sounds better as the questions are less direct. Thank you, Nicole. Anne, the first one is a yes or no question about pet ownership, whereas the second question is more open-ended and allows for more in-depth answers. Excellent points in both cases. Scott, at the right-hand column, questions give you some direction to explore, which is good. Absolutely. Victoria, the right-hand side is more specific than the left. The left is often very general. Alan, I suppose there's greater direction in the ones on the right. All of those points. Oh, Joshua, hello. Right-hand side of questions clearly appears better as it delves deeper into the why and the reasons, and probably gives further ways of using that information. Spot on in all cases. There are lots of ways in which these left-hand column questions are problematic. And I think you've covered a number of the weaknesses in the various examples here. I think it was Anne who said, does owning a pet improve quality of life for older people? Well, yes. What else is there to say? As Anne has said, no, what we need to understand is in what ways, what are the factors that means that this is the case, and what therefore could that do to inform our thinking about support for older people in the community, for instance. In some cases, there is, let me see, how do artificial sweeteners affect people? Too broad, far, far too broad. This is the kind of lifetime's work. Whereas it suddenly becomes much more focused when we confine this to a very specific group, and that is postmenopausal women who suffer from migraine. So there are two areas there, two ways in which the research question has suddenly become much more manageable. And you could also see how, from defining your question in that way, you could begin to understand, or your methodology could become clearer, because you know, well, I have to engage with postmenopausal women and postmenopausal women who suffer from migraines. So you've already got a much smaller group to work with. And you're also taking account, of course, of the sorts of variables that have to be taken account of before we can make any broader judgments. We can't simply say, how do artificial sweeteners affect people? Because it depends. It depends on their time of life. It depends if they have migraines, and so on. Other examples are white mice better than grey mice. It's not focused. I think someone had said about enough detail to be able to delve into something specific. So again, we give it a context when tested for intelligence and longevity, how do white mice and grey mice compare? These all come from a website, and there are a number of very useful websites out there which we can pass on to you subsequently. But I think it's very clear what it takes just to tweak a research question to make it feasible, something that actually requires a discussion and analysis, something which is not just giving us information or collating information that might already be out there, that has an end goal, which is maybe about making recommendations for quality of life, for medical interventions, for policy interventions, social care interventions, and so on. Are you happy enough that that gives you a little bit of an insight into what research questions look like? Just give me a little yes or thumbs up on the chat if you're happy for us to move on to our next slide now. I think we can make all of these available to you subsequently so you can come back to it. If we can just get a little yes, a little thumbs up. Thank you, Victoria, Alan, Orla, that's great. So let's move on. I think it can feel like a very a big leap even to get to the sorts of research questions that we had on the last slide. They sound very straightforward, but it takes a long time even to get to that. So here I'm going to give you just a few tips for how you can even begin to get towards a research question, because it's very hard to sit down and produce something that's fully formed. Mind mapping is one great way. Sit down, blank piece of paper. You might have an idea at the center of your mind, center of your research interests, where you think, yeah, I'd like to do something around media representations of migrant workers in the UK. Or I want to look at a new drug delivery system and work out how we could get drugs more quickly and more effectively to particular diseased areas. So it could be, it doesn't matter on the subject. You know, I think you've probably got a broad area that interests you. And just without trying to put any sort of shape or format around it, simply just get as much down on paper as you can, but linking it to those three questions of what, why, and how. So if you are interested in drug development or drug delivery that will allow medicines to get more effectively to the part of the body that needs to be treated, some of your whys could be things like, well, if we can direct medicines better, then that's cheaper for the NHS. So why could be an economic argument. So it's really important to do that because number one, we'd have better outcomes for patients, but number two, that would have a less of a burden financially on the NHS, for example. So you can see how you begin to use this very fluid, creative process that starts with a central idea, something that interests you. And if you've got a few ideas in mind, do multiple mind maps and just begin to use this very flexible process to start to think through your what, why, and how. What areas would you have to look at in order to engage with this bigger question? Why should anyone care? So what? Okay. I think another thing then as you're developing your research proposal is to think about the power of what you're communicating. I mentioned the idea of having a pitch beforehand, and I think in many ways you are pitching to a supervisor and to a funder. Imagine that a funder has got hundreds and hundreds of applications for a limited number of PhD studentships. What's going to make it stand out? There can be fantastic research ideas which don't get funded because they have not quite simply captured the imagination of the funders. And on a very practical note, when you have a lot of the doctoral training partnership competitions, the panel that ultimately makes the decisions is usually a multidisciplinary panel. So some of you who are, you may be familiar with in the UK context, in the arts, humanities and social sciences, we have two big partnerships, one in the arts and humanities, one in the social sciences, with a number of universities elsewhere in Northern the UK. But the panel ultimately comes down to a group of people, and I've been on these panels, who come from a whole range of disciplines. So you've got to capture their imagination and make them see very, very quickly why your research matters and why it needs to be done. So actually think about the notion of a sales pitch. And maybe some of you have come across the idea of an elevator pitch before. But if you haven't, the premise is quite simple. As it suggests, imagine that you have arrived in work and it's a high-rise building, and you arrive at the elevator, at the lift, ready to go up to your office on, say, the 10th floor. And who happens to walk in but the chairman, the most senior person in the business. And you're thinking, this is my opportunity. This is my opportunity to sell my idea to him. So you both get into the lift together, him or her, I should say. You get into the lift together and you have got a minute, 90 seconds to make the case for your idea. And basically, taking away all the kind of specific content, basically the elevator pitch is what you see here. It's about, in usually a minute, saying, okay, so there's a big problem out there. It could be a problem in an organization. It could be a global problem, a local problem, but there's a problem and it's having a bad impact on people. So first of all, your boss immediately sees, okay, there's an issue that needs to be addressed here, front and center. Now I'm working on this thing, and that thing is a bit like things you've heard of before, as it says here, but it's different. But mine is a little bit different from what everyone else has done. And it's that little bit of difference which is going to mean that I will have an impact where others have not. And I'll be the one who'll be able to resolve this problem or reduce its negative effects on people. And if you think about what you see there in that speech bubble, it's basically what, why, and how. Perhaps in a slightly different order, but essentially it's what, why, and how. And that is, again, where you need to come right back to. So I'm going to show you an example of what this can look like in practice. This would be something that you would do further down the line when you are studying for your PhD. The elevator pitch is based on a 1-minute pitch, and it's something that's also used very commonly in business, or if you have a business idea, product development, and you're pitching there to get investment. In the context of research, the equivalent is something called the 3-minute thesis. Some of you may have come across this before, but this was a competition that started initially in Australia and then became global. And all universities every year, most universities, have a 3-minute thesis competition. And it's very simple. The rules are very simple. They are that a student has 3 minutes to be able to sell their research. They are allowed 1 PowerPoint slide, nothing more, and 3 minutes to do it in. Now, we won't have time to discuss this, but you can see on the slide I have here some questions. The website here, you can go back onto that at any time. It's on the VTI website. And here you have the 6 finalists for the 2019 3-minute thesis UK competition. And I'm just going to show you the winner in 1 second. We'll move on to that. But as you listen to the winner, bear in mind those questions you've got here. Think about, what do they do well? What sort of strategies do they use to communicate their research? How do they demonstrate the what, why, and the how? And take that away, and from there, think about how you can begin to apply that to a research proposal, which is going to be longer. It's 750 words, 1,000 words, but ultimately it has to do exactly the same thing. So if we could possibly just see that video now of last year's winner of the National 3-minute thesis.
By the end of today, wastewater treatment plants across the UK will have received 11 billion litres of wastewater, enough to fill 4,400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. This wastewater contains a considerable amount of different forms of antibiotics. And the truth is, the majority will not be removed before the wastewater is discharged into lakes and rivers. What this means is that bacteria occurring naturally in the environment become exposed to antibiotics and become resistant over time, thereby rendering antibiotics less effective in treating infections. The World Health Organization estimates that antibiotic resistance could lead to the deaths of 10 million people annually. So the aim of my research is to develop a cheap and effective method for removing antibiotics, which can be incorporated into our wastewater treatment systems. And therefore, I present to you the sawdust redemption. Yes, sawdust. Sawdust is a waste product of wood processing. It's an ideal material not just because it is cheap and easily accessible, but it has been proven to remove toxic chemicals from water. Also, sawdust contains properties that could potentially interact with antibiotics. And the sawdust used for this research is sourced from a local sawmill. This treatment method is based on a mechanism called adsorption. In simple terms, adsorption is the attachment of tiny particles to the surface of a material. I've explored the potential of sawdust to remove two antibiotics, namely meropenem and ciprofloxacin. These widely used antibiotics have been identified by the World Health Organization as being in danger of losing their efficacy. As you can see, when I expose these antibiotics to sawdust for up to 24 hours through the process of adsorption, I was able to successfully remove up to 80% of the antibiotics. I'm sure you would agree with me that close to 100% should be the target. And this is achievable as the efficiency of the sawdust can be improved through various chemical modifications, some of which I have tested in the lab. So what do I want to achieve? By the end of my research, I will have explored the full potential of my sawdust treatment and achieving close to 100% removal. And also, I will design a small-scale treatment process that can be adopted by wastewater treatment plants. This will be the sawdust redemption to the antibiotic problem in water. Thank you.
And just coming back now to the PowerPoint. It's a really nice example, a great example of 3-minute thesis at its best. Maybe we could just take a little moment. Exactly, Alan. Wow, thank you. That's my feeling as well, I must say. My only disappointment is that it is not a Queen student, that there's a student from the other place. Alan, absolutely, we feel like clapping. Maybe just share with us some of the thoughts that you have about what this student did so well. I mean, this is fairly technical, this is fairly specialist. I'm not from that background, my own background is humanities. What did he do so well that you could possibly take into your own research proposal? Thanks, Ian. Yes, it's a great example. Take a moment just to share any thoughts about what he does particularly well. Okay, we have got some comments coming in. Thank you, Alan. Within the first 30 seconds, I understood the problem. Absolutely. And you understood that it was a problem that was worth solving. I think that's a really key point. Ian, absolutely. The humour around the sawdust redemption, the play on words helps engage us. Exactly. There is something about, language craft as well, word craft here. And humour as well. Immediately, we're gripped. Absolutely. Any other thoughts coming through on those? Okay, I'll keep an eye on the chat and see if any others come up. But I think some of the other things we would want to maybe flag up are the fact that, it's a very, very careful. Oh, Anne here, let's see what Anne has to say. The problem solution is articulated really well. Yeah. And he explains clearly the ways in which he is building on things that have been done before, but how his own approach is different. Yes. And all of that gives us absolute confidence that his research is going to have an impact. And that is what's really key. We know what he's going to do, and says again, quickly and clearly spells out lots of different things he's considering. Yeah, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do with only one slide as well. He blends really quite specialist ideas and research with non-specialist language so that we, regardless of our background, know exactly what it is he's trying to do. It's clear very quickly why this needs to be done, because it's about better outcomes for people in terms of health. But he also talks about the economic impact and the savings there of the work that he will do. He uses statistics very compellingly as well. He talks about the 100% that he's almost going to get. So a great example, and please do go back to the website and look at other examples in other disciplinary areas. But ultimately, that's the kind of impact you want to have your research proposal to generate in your reader. There's a lot also around body language, about the non-verbal side, really exaggerating gestures and so on. But even in the text itself, he's working incredibly well. We have Scott coming in. He was well researched because he chose to study the 2 most effective antibiotics to conduct his research. So again, a very nice point. It suggests to me that maybe Scott knows a little bit more about the subject. So what he manages to do is balance speaking to people who have a specialist knowledge and who will know, yeah, that's a good choice of antibiotics, as well as those who have very little knowledge, and it makes sense to both of them. That's a very, very fine balance. And Victoria, thank you very much, Victoria. Very direct, very simple, how he can solve the problem. And that's a great point just to move on with by saying that, again, we can end up obsessing about really complex language, really complex theoretical models. If you can't articulate what you want to do in a direct, simple way, then there will be a problem with your research proposal. Now, our 3-minute thesis colleague, thank you all for your contributions there. Our 3-minute thesis colleague really helped us also to see the why and indeed the how. So just a few pointers on the why and the how, and we'll probably take about another 10 minutes on the presentation, and then we'll come back for some more questions if there are any. So he made it very clear to us why this research needed to be done. Better outcomes for people in terms of health, economic impact, and new methodologies as well, so contributing also to research in the field. And in some ways, what I'm going to suggest to you is that thinking about the why as your starting point when you're trying to consider your research focus can often be the most compelling place to start. And that can be helpful for you to go back to things like, why do I want to work in this area? Why do I care about this? Because if you don't care about it, then it'll be hard for others to feel the passion and commitment that you have to improving a situation. And yes, you have to think about why it's important for academic study, but often the best place to start is because it is from what you want to be different as a result of your work. Most researchers come into PhDs because they want to make the world a better place. It sounds terribly idealistic, but that's ultimately what it's about. So focusing on the why is really important. So in terms of just a definition of what impact is, this is our kind of standard definition that we use, because impact is now one of the key metrics that is used to assess research quality in the UK. It's not just about a really excellent publication, it's about the ability of our research to impact positively. So research is defined as the demonstrable contribution that excellent research makes to society and the economy. And that can occur in lots of ways: new knowledge and innovation, new products. It can be about job creation. It can be about enhancing public services and policy, quality of life, health, and also bear in mind sometimes in the arts and humanities we think, it's hard for us to demonstrate impact. But think about kind of cultural production as a very, very key way of enhancing quality of life. So culture and well-being are huge areas where you can also demonstrate a contribution to society. And I've just put down a few pointers of why we should care about impact. I think it's what keeps it going. I think we do have a responsibility to do it. And also in a more instrumental way, it is now absolutely expected. So any panel looking at your proposal, thinking of giving you funding, we'll be looking very clearly to see what the potential impact is. And I stress potential. We don't know what the impact is going to be, and that's why we need to do the research. But it's about explaining what potential impact is and the various pathways that you will put in place in your research to enable that impact to happen. So different types of research impact. Absolutely, academic impact is front and center. We want to make a contribution to scientific advances across and within disciplines. We want people to think differently, the scholars in our fields to think differently. We want to come up with new methods, new theories. But we also want to see that that has a broader impact beyond the world of academia, that people outside will also benefit from what we do. And as I said, that can come in lots of different forms. I think often in arts, humanities and social sciences, the gold standard of impact is to change a policy, change government policy. That's so hard to do, but my goodness me, that's exactly where we need to be focusing our efforts. But as you can see from the bottom example, it's not just about maybe creating a new product. It can simply be about quality of life, health, creative output. Or it can be economic. And if you think back to our 3-minute thesis winner, I think he showed a number of those very, very clearly. Enhancing quality of life and health, but also the fostering global economic performance, etc. And the point I was just making at the start was that my top tip actually for powering your research proposal is to start with the why. And increasingly, that's what we're all doing in all of our research projects, more established academics. They're starting with the what could be different. In some ways, if you start from what do I want to change? How do I want people to think differently? What can I do to improve quality of life or health outcomes, whatever it might be? It's almost about designing backwards from the impact. Methodology is a huge area in itself. And so all I want to do is to say, this is the how. This is about convincing your panel, your supervisor, that you have a fair idea about how you would go about this, what you would do on Monday morning in some ways. Again, this will develop because the research findings will change as you go along. But really what you want to do is set out a sense that you kind of know how you'll begin to approach this. There are some really good books out there which can help you think about the range of methods that you could be using. Some arts and humanities are more likely to use qualitative research methods. More of the hardcore sciences are likely to be using quantitative methods. Social sciences typically using mixed methods research. If you're very interested in talking about developing your research proposal, let us know. We'll put you in touch with a potential supervisor and they will give you more specific guidance on how you begin to think about how you do research. But if you're interested in the range of methods and what underpins them, publications like this one is a great start. Just wanted to mention maybe some of the future webinars that we've got coming up, whether research methods can be anything from surveys, questionnaires, experimental methods, semi-structured interviews, discourse analysis, a whole range of possibilities. But what underpins them all is having good critical thinking skills, because that's what helps you create good arguments, which is the basis for your PhD. It's that helps you solve the real world problems. It allows you to examine problems, situations and issues from all angles. And it allows you also to understand what have other people said in this area and what's missing in their work and how can I contribute. So in the coming weeks on the website where you maybe have picked up the details about today's webinar, you'll find a number of upcoming events around things like creative thinking and critical problem solving. As myself and other colleagues will be doing those, and we'll introduce you to a whole range of really excellent tools that help you develop your skills in creative and critical thinking. And those are such an important underpinning to the research methodologies that you end up using. So please do keep an eye out for those, and it'd be great to see you again. I'm just going to move just to a close now because I want to have a little bit of time possibly to take some questions from you. I think some of the key points that have come out hopefully today, one is demystify all of the academic vocabulary around what a proposal should be and what research should be, and simply get back to the very simple what, why, how. That's really hard to do, but if you have that clear in your mind, that's an excellent starting point. I think the second point I would make is, whilst I do them in the what, why, how order, in some ways, there's real value in starting with the why, because the why is the motivation, it's what keeps you going, keeps you motivated, but it's also what will convince funders that actually this person is going to do something different. So I always think in terms of designing for impact. Ask yourself, what's going to be different? Who will it be different for? And that will provide the sort of compelling case for your research that we saw in the 3-minute thesis competition. And I love this model. I'm just going to finish with that. It's a model that I have used not just in research, but in all sorts of areas of my professional life as well, when I want to think about how can we in our teams do a better job? How can we design differently to have better outcomes? How can we impact our students differently? How can we enhance their experience? So you start in this, it's an appreciative inquiry model. Start at the top with your describe. And what you want to do is say, okay, where are we now? What's the situation now? So when I've done this professionally with my teams, it's about thinking, okay, what sort of service are we offering to students at the moment? And then I say, okay, that's fine. But what if we were to dream? What if we were not to worry about the practicalities, not to worry about the obstacles, not to worry about workloads, not to worry about financial implications? What if we were just to dream about what it could be like? And that's the really important part, because if you don't do the dream bit, you're always underestimating the potential impact of what you can do. And once you've got the dream clarified, that's when you begin to design. That's in a research context, that's about thinking about the research methodology, the steps that you will take, how you will actually go about doing this. And then you deliver. If we don't do the dream bit, we often are constrained by practicalities. We go straight from describe to design. And if we do that, we're tending still to work within the same parameters that we work in all the time. And those are the parameters that have prevented us from really changing things already. So this is a great, great model to be used in a whole range of areas of life. And the important part of it is to make sure you do the dream part. You'll not be able to do everything, but if you have a vision of how things could be different in the future and what you would like that to look like, then everything else comes in behind that, including your questions, your methodology, and so on. So my final point before we maybe pause for some questions is remember to dream. Thank you all very much, and it's great that we were able to have some interaction and some questions. I'm really happy to stay on now for as long as there are any other questions you'd like to ask. And please also even just make yourself known to us if you would like us to try to link you up with a potential supervisor who would help you think through some of these questions in a more disciplinary fashion. But the ideas here are as applicable for hard sciences as they are for arts and humanities. This is what every piece of research should be about: what, why, and how. So thank you, everyone. And we'll just maybe take the pause in the slide and stay on for a few moments in case there are any further questions. And thank you so much. What would that email be to get in touch about going forwards? Can I just call on Orla there? Orla, what would be the best way for Anne to contact us directly? Would it be to email yourselves on domestic recruitment?
Hello, Margaret. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely. I'm just thinking, what would be the best way for us to collate any potential interested candidates and get them moved into discussions with a supervisor? Would it be by yourselves in the first instance, and then you could link them up to faculty?
Yeah, following today's webinar, there's going to be an email sent out to everyone on Monday morning, which will include a playback of this clip, but it will also include some email addresses and web links where you can go to. So for example, there's an area on the website, find a PhD supervisor, and we'll be including the link in that with the email. So the best way is to take it forward. We actually have a search facility on the website where you can type in your area of interest, and then it brings up different PhD supervisors. So that will all be included within the email. If there's any other issues, the best thing would be to drop me a line, and it's studentrecruitment@qub.ac.uk. So I'll type that into the text box just so that everyone knows.
I think I've just done it. If I've spelt it correctly, it's in there now.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah. So any questions, you can drop a line to student recruitment, but also look out for that email which is coming out on Monday, which will have all the links.
And just a specific piece of advice there, I think Orla is absolutely right. The search tool is the way to go, and then you can always engage with a supervisor directly. Given where things are at the moment, and people are involved in so much around the kind of COVID response, it may be, depending who you contact, that they're very involved in other areas as well. So if you don't get a response quickly, and by which I mean within a couple of days, do make sure to come back to either myself. You can find me on the graduate school website. I'll put my email address in as well, or to our colleagues in student recruitment, and they will make sure that we can direct the query in a way that makes sure that it is answered. I should also say that you'll find on our website, and that will be included in the details that colleagues will send on to you, that there are some parts of the university where they advertise specific projects. So you can go on and look for PhD opportunities. And under that, not all subjects do this. It's a bit of a disciplinary variety here. But there will be a number of places where you could go and you will see a supervisor who is advertising a particular project. They'll still expect you to respond to that with your own what, why, and how. But that's a very nice way also to engage with a supervisor who's looking for a supervisee and who is saying, here is a piece of work that needs to be done. Are you the person to do it? And then you just need to show them that, yeah, with your what, why, and how, you are the person who can do this. So have a look at that as well. And I think, yes, we also had Victoria would also be very interested in getting linked up with a potential supervisor. So again, Victoria, I think in the meantime, get straight onto that website that Orla has mentioned, but also I think let us know that you're doing that so that we have a record of participants on this webinar, and we can make sure that the follow-up happens, just in case potential supervisors are so involved in other things at the moment that the email slips through the net. And I think we can just stay on a few more minutes, given there is a little bit of a delay in the chat coming up. We'll stay on a few more minutes. Please also feel free to leave us any feedback on whether this was useful, and if there are any areas that you would have liked seen covered. If there's anything that's missing, we can certainly aim to put in another webinar to answer any questions that haven't been looked at. Alan is also going to have a look for us, have a look at the PhD website. That's great, Alan, and just keep us posted and we'll make sure you get your queries answered. Victoria, thank you very much. Thanks for being on the webinar. I think probably some people will start leaving us now. So just a final word of thanks from me. It was great to be able to be a little bit interactive, and we're here to answer any more questions, and yet look out for the other webinars. They're going to give you great insights into things like creative and critical thinking. I'm just going to turn my video off, but I will be on for another few minutes, another 5-10 minutes in case anyone has a question. So bye-bye everyone and take care.